Well, hello everyone and welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of reproduction in plants. Now that we've done with the more boring asexual stuff, let's get to the juicy stuff of plant sexual reproduction. So in this part, we're going to be looking at how plants reproduce sexually. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the flower, which, if you remember, is the reproductive organ of a plant. And here are the textbook pages to help you out. But let's start off by reminding ourselves of what is needed in sexual reproduction. So remember that in sexual reproduction, we need a male gamete and a female gamete. I hope that you can recall that the gametes are haploid, right? Haploid meaning that they only contain one set of chromosomes. If you've forgotten what that means, go back to watch the first video on reproduction. Right, and of course these gametes, they will need to fuse. Right? In particular, it is the nucleus of the male gamete that will fuse with the nucleus of the female gamete. And the process is called fertilization, and they will form a zygote. Now the zygote receives one set of chromosomes from the male, another set of chromosomes from the female, so it has two sets of chromosomes and is called diploid. Okay, so we need a male gamete and we need a female gamete. Now, in animals, the male gamete is a sperm, and the female gamete is an egg. But in plants, where are the gametes? Where are the gametes in plants? Well, I think you probably have some idea that the gametes of a plant are found in flowers. So here's a side view of a flower. And then you probably have some idea that the male gametes have something to do with pollen. Right? So yes, the male gamete of plants are found inside pollen grains, and the pollen grains can be found in the anthers of a flower. Right? We'll look at it a bit more later. Now, if you take a closer look at a pollen grain under the microscope and look inside the pollen grain, if I were to look inside it, you'll find something very interesting. Because a pollen grain has two nuclei. That's different from a usual cell. And these two nuclei, they have different functions. So the first nucleus is called the generative nucleus. Now this is the nucleus that will eventually fuse with the egg. Right, and so this nucleus is actually the male gamete. This is the male gamete. The other nucleus, it's called the pollen tube nucleus. And we'll see later that it has an important role. It's kind of like, it will sacrifice itself to help the generative nucleus to reach the egg. Right, so this nucleus is going to become a pollen tube. It forms like a pathway for the male gamete here, the generative nucleus, to travel down to meet his egg cell. So this is a very nice sacrificial guy, but he doesn't fuse with the egg. Now on the other hand, you probably have some idea that the female gametes, you have some idea that they're found inside the ovary and in particular inside the ovules. Right, so you probably remember this from primary school. So the ovules are found somewhere here inside the ovary. We'll look at it later. So let me just flesh out the ovule. If you take a closer look into this region, right, what you will see, this is the ovary. Right, this is the ovule. And if you take a look inside the ovule, there are quite a number of cells, but one of the cells inside the ovule is the egg cell. It is the female gamete. So the female gamete is found inside the ovule, and the male gamete is found inside the pollen grain. Right, that's the main point of this slide. Got it? Okay, so that's where our gametes are found in plants. Alright, so now that we know what the male gamete and the female gamete are in plants, let's take a look at the big picture of what sexual reproduction in plants involves. So we'll start here at the flower, which we just looked at. So remember that the flowers are the reproductive organs of a plant, and that's where we find the gametes. That's where we find the male gametes and female gametes. Right, the male gametes, of course, are found in the pollen grains, and the female gametes are found in the ovules. Now, for plants, there are two important processes that need to take place during sexual reproduction. The first process is called pollination. Right, pollination is when the pollen is transferred from the male parts to the female parts of a flower. So that transfer of pollen is important. And then after pollination, there will be fertilization. So that's when the male gamete nucleus actually fuses with the female gamete nucleus. And then we'll form a fertilized egg or an embryo. This is the seed. And the seed will then grow into a new plant. Of course, growth always involves mitosis. Right? Mitosis is just producing identical cells. So we'll divide to form a new plant. And this new plant will grow. Eventually it will grow flowers. And then the flowers, inside the flowers, gametes reproduce, and then we start the cycle of sexual reproduction again. Alright, so now for the rest of the video, we're going to take a closer look at a flower and the parts of a flower and how they work together to help plants reproduce sexually. Okay, so here is a flower diagram, and you can find this in your textbook and also in your notes. So I'm going to start off with the part of the flower called the sepal. Right, it is a part of the flower that's probably not often noticed. But it is this circle of leaf-like structures at the bottom and the base of the flower, below the petals. Now the sepals are actually modified leaves, and they are there to protect the flower when it's developing. So you might have seen flower buds before, right? They are green color, like kind of flower buds, and then these are actually the sepals. Eventually they will open up, and then the flower will emerge from there. Now the sepals form a ring, so there's usually a ring of sepals, one here, probably one in front here and one behind. And this ring of sepals, we call it the calyx. Now some plants also have an apicalyx, which is another ring of modified leaves that lie below the sepal, right? But not very important lah. Alright, next we have probably the most famous part of the flower, he loves me not part. It is the petals, right? And the very obvious brightly colored petals, especially in flowers which are pollinated by insects. The petals are also modified leaves, right? And they also form a ring. So if you take a look at a flower from the top, you will see that the petals form a ring. And all that ring of petals all together, we call it the corolla, right? The corolla. So as mentioned, the petals are usually brightly colored in insect-pollinated flowers. Now at the base of the flower, we have two important parts. Firstly, the receptacle, and also the flower stalk or the pedicel. Okay, so the pedicel is the flower stalk, and the receptacle is actually part of that stalk. It's an enlarged part that the flower sits on, that all the flower parts are attached to. So basically the sepals are attached to it, the petals are attached to it. It forms the base of the flower. Alright, so this diagram here is just to help you to have a better idea of what is the calyx and the corolla. So this is a view of the flower if you're looking at it from the top. Alright, so imagine if I draw my flower, this is like a tulip flower, right? And I'm looking at it now from the top view, like that. What you will see is actually kind of 4 rings, right? 4 rings of flower parts. There's this outermost ring here. This is a ring of sepals, right? That's called the calyx. And then you have the ring of petals, that's the corolla. And then you have a ring of male parts, the stamens, right? This is called the androecium. Andro meaning male. And then of course you have the kind of female parts. Actually, it can also be a ring of female parts. We'll see later. It's called the gynoecium, right? Gynoecium. Right, this is actually all the female parts forming a ring together. So actually flowers are made out of 4 rings of parts, right? Interesting. Alright, so remember there's that outer ring of sepals, that's your calyx here. Then you have the ring of petals, which is the corolla. And now we're going to look at the ring of male parts. So this is the male parts of a flower. The stamen, right? The stamen is a male part of the flower, and it is made up of the anther, where the pollen grains are produced, and the filaments which hold up the anther, allowing the pollen to be dispersed. So if you take a closer look at the anthers, this is what you'll find. So this is the anther, right? This is the filament here. This is the anther, and we're actually cutting it across to look inside. So what you will see inside the anther, you'll see 2 lobes, right? So one lobe here, and the other lobe here. And each lobe contains 2 pollen sacs, right? One sac here, one sac here. And what is happening inside these pollen sacs? Well, pollen grains are being produced. and the pollen grains contain the male gametes, right? So the pollen grains are being produced through the process of meiosis, right? Which I hope you can remember. Meiosis helps to produce the gametes. Now, anthers also contain a vascular bundle over here. Hopefully, you remember what vascular bundles do. They help to transport water and nutrients to the parts of the plant. So why is that important here? Well, I leave you to think of it. Probably these cells here also need nutrients and water. Alright, finally, we look at the female part of the plant. Now, the female part of the plant is called the carpel. The carpel. And the carpel is made out of several parts. Firstly, we have the stigma, which is the tip. This is the sticky part usually that helps to receive the pollen grains. And the stigma is held up by the style. Right? So here's the style, which connects the stigma to the ovary down here. Alright, and at the bottom of the style, we'll find the ovary. So here's an ovary. And interestingly, the ovary is the part of the flower that develops into a fruit. Right? So the fruits they eat in the supermarket, they were all once ovaries. So after fertilization, the ovary develops into a fruit. Now, the main function of the ovary is to produce and to protect the ovule. So here's the ovule. Now, the ovule is the part of the flower that eventually develops into the seed of a fruit after fertilization. And it's also inside the ovule where the female gamete is produced. And the female gamete is produced, again, through meiosis. So here is where meiosis occurs. So the ovule is where meiosis occurs to produce the female gamete. There's this attachment is where the ovule is attached to the ovary. So you can see this is the ovary wall, and the ovule is attached to it. And this little attachment here is called the funicle. Right, the placenta basically is just the wall of the ovary. Okay? Alright, so here's a rough idea of how a flower becomes a fruit. Okay, so here is an example of the tomato flower. Now, the tomato flower, the female part is actually made up of 3 carpels which are fused together. So let's take a closer look at the ovary of a tomato flower. What you will see is something like this if you look at it from the top. You'll see 3 carpels, one carpel here, another carpel here, another carpel here, and they're all fused together to form one ovary. You can see the ovules here, which are attached to the placenta in the center. Now, after fertilization, when you form the tomato fruit, can you see that actually it's very similar? You can still see the seeds, so the ovules have become the seeds, right? The carpels, which were fused together to form the ovary, have become the fruit, and the placenta is still here in the middle. Right? So that's that kind of, even when you cut open your fruits now, you can kind of tell what part used to be the ovary, which part used to be the ovule. Okay, I think I'm just going to stop at this point and pause before the next video, but let me leave you with a question. Now, if you take a look at the diagram that is in your textbook, you will see a flower that has both male parts, right, the stamen, and female parts, the carpels. So this is actually a bisexual flower, right? It has both male and female parts. Now, you don't see that in humans, right? You all laughed at this diagram the last time when I saw the ovaries and the testes in the same person. Right, but in flowers, we do get bisexual flowers where they have both male and female parts in one flower. The question to leave with you is, are all flowers bisexual? Alright, and to find out the answer, do your own research and come back to the next video. I'll see you there.